Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Gavin Cleese, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm happy to welcome you to our program this evening, whether you're joining us in person or virtually. While I see a lot of familiar faces in the room, I'd like to offer a special welcome to anyone who might be joining us for the first time. The Massachusetts Historical Society is the first historical society in America. We date back to 1791. We are an independent, nonprofit organization that maintains a research library that provides access to a remarkable collection of manuscripts, including the papers of 3 U.S. presidents, as well as soldiers, mothers, poets, and protesters. We host a wide variety of programs that explore the history of Massachusetts and the history of America. These programs are both for academic audiences and for the general public. We're only able to host these programs and seminars thanks to the support of our members and donors, and I hope that if you appreciate these events, you return for more and you consider becoming a member or making a donation. This evening, we'll hear from Dr. Samuel Forman on his new book, Ill-Fated Frontier. This work explores the saga of Revolutionary War General David Forman, who attempted to create a plantation empire in Spanish West Florida. He employed his young cousin, Samuel S. Forman, and an experienced overseer to drive the general's 60 enslaved African Americans across 2,400 miles of dangerous frontier. Despite their enslavement, they overcame countless dangers and eventually took on the Herculean task of building a future cotton plantation. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Forman, is a physician, military officer, and historian. He is an instructor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and an avid researcher of American history and the history of science. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming him.
Gavin, thanks for the opportunity to come here. The Massachusetts Historical Society, of course, is a favorite for people who are fans of history, researchers of history, and people who just celebrate the American experience. And my journey in researching and writing this book actually started right here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. That might not be terribly obvious for a book whose topic is the early American West and South during the Revolutionary era, but I think it will come out as to why that is the case. And I think some of the staffers may assert that all roads start from Mass Historical Society or certainly end here. I don't know if I entirely agree with that, but this particular work, I think, tends to demonstrate at least some truth in that. So this book came out rather recently, and I researched it, fortunately, in the so-called before times, before the lockdowns, which included a number of archives in the relevant regions, in addition to here, and also travels approximating the pioneers of the 18th century who made this epic trek. So let me tell you a little bit about why I researched and wrote this book and why I have a lot of enthusiasm for it. I hope some of it's shared. It does shed light on a period of American history that, at least until recently, not much academic research has been done, and it's not yet, I think, in the popular mind. It has to do with post-Revolutionary War time period. It's the early republic, if you will, and it bridges some very significant issues that the United States and its peoples faced in the first years and decades of the United States that bridged the Revolutionary era into the era of the War of 1812, and even more so the antebellum era. So the way I first became aware of this particular story and why I focused so much effort on it was actually came from a reader of my biography of Joseph Warren, the Revolutionary War hero, Bunker Hill and what have you, whose biography I wrote about a decade ago. And they approached me and asked me very solicitously whether I was a descendant, after all, so interested in Revolutionary era topics, of the Formans of Philadelphia. Revolutionary era Formans of Philadelphia. And of course, my answer was no. I couldn't possibly be. And that triggered an interesting conversation. How are you so sure that you're not related to these people? Well, my people are Ellis Island, Jewish people from what is now modern Ukraine, and I couldn't possibly be related to the Formans of Philadelphia and New York era of the Revolutionary War period. But the reason why this person pointed out, though, was that she was aware of a diary that had been published well over 100 years ago of a Forman pioneering effort that originated in the New York-Philadelphia axis and traveled all the way across the then United States frontier, both west and south, to what was then not even part of the United States, Spanish West Florida. And that this diary, which was published actually decades after the fact by one of the protagonists, is a very rare firsthand account of pioneering in this time frame. There are very few firsthand accounts. So I read it. It's about 60 pages. It was published in the 1880s by a founder of the Wisconsin Historical Society, who was very careful about preserving primary manuscripts that have relevance to the West and South. And I was just so excited by what I read. This was an adventure that I couldn't have made up as fiction. And although it was written from the point of view of really plantation entrepreneurs who were going south to seek their fortune, but reading in between the lines, it was also a story of 60 enslaved African Americans who were reluctant pioneers on this venture. The Native Americans encountered along the way, who were not just neutral observers, but in fact had the upper hand against American settlers during the Northwest Indian War. So in order to traverse this territory, and I'm going to show some maps since it's not so well known, this time frame and what it really looked like on the ground, that they had to traverse hostile Indian territory, so to speak, at a time when the natives had the upper hand in the West, unlike some sanitized maps being published of the Northwest Territory and our interest in the politics of the Northwest Territory, at least the view from Washington. This is also a story of Latino colonials, Spanish colonials, who were not at all incompetent, but were very effective in representing an agenda of their colonial empire in what we would now call the Mississippi Delta, or the Deep South, but was then part of Spanish West Florida. Another thing that attracted me to this story was that people of color are in every way integral to this story. So for me, this was a revisiting of what I always found as exciting Western Americana kind of tropes, to revisit that in a more inclusive and factual kind of way, in a way that was new to me. So just in doing the research, and this probably shows, comes across in the book, I have a lot of enthusiasm for the topic and writing it in a very engaging way because it was actually quite new to me. And I didn't have a lot of preconceived notions, except that most Americana that focuses in on the West actually is in a much later time frame of Custer's Last Stand and Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, really mid to late 19th century interactions in what we would now call the far west of American expansionism and interaction with Native Americans at that time. But in fact, this earlier experience may well have been much more deciding of subsequent history and is much lesser known. So I approached writing the story and researching it as nonfiction. And some of the details, and I'll kind of give an overview of the plot of this, were so engaging, surprising, that I didn't want to be accused of any of this is fiction. So I came up with so many endnotes and footnotes that my publisher balked. The number of endnotes in primary sources and recent scholarship of excellent secondary sources is so voluminous that it's as much in page count as the book itself. So I set up a website, which I'll describe, which has all the endnotes, which the publisher wanted to save some pages on. So at any rate, so this is a story of a pioneering group originating on the West Coast, or East Coast, excuse me, and going across the then West and South and establishing a presence in Spanish West Florida, specifically Natchez. So it's a micro-history, but it's not. Micro-history is something we encounter quite a bit nowadays, where you focus in on a compelling individual or a small family group who are interesting in themselves, so far as biographically, but can illustrate some themes and topics that might otherwise be very dry or inaccessible. So this bridges it in that this pioneer group included 15 members and dependents of this Forman family from central New Jersey, Philadelphia, New York area, and also 60 African Americans. It's about 75 people made this journey. And when they arrived at the port of Natchez in Spanish West Florida, a part of then Louisiana, they increased the population of Spanish West Florida by 2 to 3% just by arriving. So statistically, I mean, is this a microhistory or not? I mean, this is part of the founding story of that part of the country. And I would say it bridges microhistory and macrohistory. Also, I took the opportunity to delve into, learn, absorb, and incorporate into the story a lot of current scholarship involving Native Americans, Spanish American colonials, and African Americans. And if you find interest in this story through its notes, footnotes, and bibliography, I hope it will make an excellent entree into recent scholarship of the last 1 or 2 decades, which is not otherwise broadly known. So let's start out with a map. So this is probably where I started from, and maybe some of you people in this room. Some of you may recognize this. This is and let me attribute it so I don't have a copyright problem. This is a New Yorker magazine cover from the Centennial. So it's quite a while ago, although it regularly is reprinted. And it purports to be a comic map of the United States. So what it is, it's sort of Manhattan-centric, looking west. And this is, I believe, where the term flyover country either came from or was popularized. Because if you look closely at the map, there really isn't much between downtown Manhattan and the Pacific coast. You know, Los Angeles, San Francisco, maybe, and this is like nothing in between. And in 1976, this was a joke, and it's still kind of funny. It elicits smiles. But I would maintain that there's actually a serious undercurrent to that. Like those people following the 2016 presidential election were surprised at the results, regardless of party, might want to think about their knowledge base of this part of the country, both strengths and things that you might consider things that you don't want to know so well, and master it in a way that is second nature to you, and you have absorbed it. I believe if I and other people had been of that frame of mind in that time frame, the results of that election would not have been a surprise. But nevertheless, just researching and telling this story had me immerse myself into the Midwest and Delta South in ways that I fancied myself fairly well informed of the Revolutionary era that was, frankly, embarrassingly new to me. So let's look at a real map. So the frontispiece of the book, often it's colorful pictures of the people involved. I picked as my frontispiece the map of the United States in this time frame of 1789 to 90, when this epic trek occurred, and traced in the dark line the 2,400-mile journey of this pioneering group from the middle of New Jersey, Monmouth specifically, to Natchez. Why Natchez? Well, Natchez was the capital of Spanish West Florida, such as it was. Total population of Spanish West Florida by their own censuses in that time frame is approximately 2,100, 2,200. Of whom half, or a little bit more, not quite half, were enslaved African Americans. The Native Americans were not part of that particular census, but they probably outnumbered the Caucasian and African American people at that time. But Spanish West Florida itself, and this may be part of confusion of historians, wasn't really much of what we would call modern Florida. It was all of what we would call Mississippi, all of Alabama, a little southwestern piece of Tennessee, and the panhandle of Florida. That's the only part of modern Florida. So think of all of this territory, the population, white and black, of around 21 or 2,200. Now, there's a founder's effect there, though. I mean, we could just dismiss it. I mean, this is far smaller than a population than any suburb in Massachusetts currently. But I would maintain that this small population kind of set the stage and the flavor for a lot of the subsequent history of that entire region and of the Deep South in general. The founder's effect, I think historians discuss it. So I believe that that was operating here. So although it was small, it was very impactful. So what got this thing started? Oh, and here's a kind of an interpretation of a map that was published at the time after the end of the Revolutionary War. This is one of many maps being published, this one in London, but it reflects a kind of an American point of view, where the green is now American territories, post-revolution, as the Northwest Territory and Southwest Territory. But in fact, it was aspirational in that most of these lands in the West and South were contested. The British did not evacuate most of their forts during the 1780s. The Spanish, West Florida, had dominion and people on the ground, settlers and military, in Spanish West Florida, what we would call Mississippi, Alabama. Major Native American tribes held sway over territory where the sovereignty lay. In the Northwest Territory, what we were calling the Northwest Territory, an Indian confederation of 3 tribes was dominating on the ground, and settlers could not settle there unless they took life and limb in hand. So that's here's another take on it. If you look down south to Georgia, this is like an update of a map from would have been published 1790, 91. You'll see the southern states, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, are just kind of projecting westward. They're part of the dominion of the United States. But what I'm asserting is that reality on the ground was that the Spanish and several Native American nations were, in fact, sovereign in those areas and did not recognize American authority, and in fact, actively opposed it. Okay, so let's talk about the protagonist. So the fellow on the right is sort of energizing this entire enterprise. General David Forman, a minor Revolutionary War general who bragged about his associations with George Washington, though it seems as though George wanted to have very little to do with him in return. This guy just either brought to the fore or somehow magnified controversy. He was accused of executing loyalists without trial during the Revolutionary War. He was involved in an international incident known as the Azkill Incident. General Washington assigned him as the person with most local knowledge to General Lee's staff during the 1778 Battle of Monmouth, where General Lee apparently did some treasonous activities. And good old General Forman was more than happy to testify against his boss at General Lee's court-martial. Late in the Revolutionary War, General Forman was overseeing like a surveillance or spying type of ring to keep track of British movements going in and out of occupied New York. Meanwhile, he himself was a farmer, more specifically a plantation owner. And his plantation and some others in Monmouth are a bit out of what we would think of plantations from that period. They were based mostly on labor of enslaved African Americans. Organizationally, they were probably something more akin to things that you would find in Virginia. During the Revolutionary War, some of the African Americans took the opportunity to leave their farms and join the British. The general had a couple of people like that who ended up listed on the Book of Negroes who were in occupied New York and left with the British when the British left in 1783. So the general was a slave owner, farmer, and had done some significant, if controversial, things as an officer during the Revolutionary War. Meanwhile, there were a lot of Formans in this neck of the woods. There were so many Formans that at least 13 fought in the Battle of Germantown around Philadelphia. These 13, and if you count in-laws, 18, according to the family's sources. There were so many of them, and this bedevils genealogists, I'm sure. The younger folks took on a convention of adopting as their middle name, not their given middle name at birth, but their father's name. So Samuel S. Forman was a younger cousin of the general, who's actually Samuel Forman. So I have this accidental namesake, which is kind of hard to get away from, even though I'm not related to him. So, the Samuel Forman is the one. Samuel S. Forman is the one on the left. He's the one who wrote the diary. He was too young to be a Revolutionary War veteran, but he kind of lionized his older cousin, General David, and many other of the family members and their associates who were Revolutionary War veterans. And he was trying to make his own way in the world, but was not a veteran himself. So the general gave him and a guy named Benajah Osman, who had been one of the general's flunkies during the Revolutionary War, a proposition. Take my African Americans from New Jersey to populate this free land grant that I got from the Spanish envoy in New York, Gardoqui. 800 prime agricultural acres in Natchez for free. And this offer was given to a number of folks who wanted to take it. A number of them considered it, but never did. General von Steuben of the Revolutionary War fame actually considered taking one of these grants and decided not to. A few others did, but without quite as dramatic results. So the catch from the Spanish standpoint was that you had to get there on your own. Once you got there, you could expect to be subsidized in a way that all the tobacco you could grow could be sold at fixed high prices in New Orleans. So you got a guaranteed crop, not paid in American paper of the kind that Alexander Hamilton was pulling his hair out at the time, like, how do we deal with this stuff? No, but in Spanish dollars, real money, specie. So you got to get there, however. And so the offer was, Samuel S. Forman was offered to be so-called supercargo, go along the way, trade goods along the way, try to self-finance this effort. Benajah Osman was the overseer on the Monmouth plantation, former underling of the general during the Revolutionary War. The two of them were supposed to take the 60 slaves down to Natchez, meet up with another family offshoot, Azkill Forman there, set up plantations. That's the plan. So they depart. Now the general was a pretty savvy fellow in ways. He never wrote down why he energized this effort, so I'm left to infer. My inference is that the handwriting was on the wall, that slavery in the North had an expiration date. A slow emancipation law was passed in Pennsylvania in 1790, and in Massachusetts, even years before that. New Jersey, as it turned out, was sort of a laggard on that thing, on that spectrum. But however, if you looked right across the Delaware River, you would see the direction that this was going. So the general's agricultural livelihood rested, in large part, almost entirely, on the labor of enslaved African Americans. Now, that being said, this plantation, I think, wasn't like some of our stereotypes of the worst of the antebellum era. These workers, these enslaved workers, had been associated with the Forman family for 1 and 2 generations. They were known to the owners, and here representatives of the Forman family are going to go with the enslaved African Americans on this epic trek. So this isn't, a stereotype which is real enough and horrible to contemplate, of slave coffles, of people torn away from their families and put into chains and whipped and forced to go downriver. This is something else, maybe in its own way, scarier, creepier. This is people known to their owners who are going to travel together. So General Forman went out of his way to keep families intact. The African Americans who had married into other families of adjoining farms, he acquired them so the families can travel together. Now that may have been just enlightened self-interest. We know of slave narratives of decades later. A major motivator for escaped slaves was the breaking up of families. So he's like taking a kind of a different approach. He's going to go out of his way to keep the families together during this trip. There were no chains of these people. They walked. They went in the wagons. The wagon train had 6 wagons and 22 horses, traveling in a retrograde Washington's crossing, right around where General Washington made his crossing around Christmas of 1776. But they're not going to freedom of America. They're going away from it. They're going from New Jersey across Pennsylvania. Let me just tell you one quick anecdote, which is kind of typical of the surprising and, I think, engaging tales, nonfiction tales of the story. So this wagon train departs around Thanksgiving, 1789, which wasn't a national holiday at the time, and crossed the Delaware River, and the first major town bypassed Philadelphia, probably because the owners didn't want their enslaved African Americans interacting with the free blacks of Philadelphia. That's not clear. But at any rate, the first major town encounter was Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Lancaster is about a town of about 3,000, fairly civilized by standards of the day, had been a major base of operations and logistics during the Revolutionary War. And picture a town of about 3,000 with agricultural folks around there, very strong religious, bicultural kind of area, partly German, Mennonite, and partly Society of Friends, and then some Anglos, right? So the sheriff is a guy named Hubley, Revolutionary War veteran, and he and the folks in the main street of Lancaster, picture this, lumbering into town, virtually unannounced, a wagon train of 6 wagons and 60 African American slaves of all ages and descriptions, families, mothers with babes in arms, their children, about 19 distinct family units that I could tell. And they come into town and they're just passing through. So Sheriff Hubley confronted this group. And some of the women who were in the town, whom I call the ladies of Lancaster, were pretty upset by this parade going through their town because it was predominantly enslaved African Americans. And there were some very strong anti-slavery feelings in that area at the time. So the ladies of Lancaster, and this is according to the diary of this slave entrepreneur, right? He's recording this. And when I don't have any reason to make this stuff up. So the ladies of Lancaster approached the enslaved African Americans and asked them if they would become domestics in houses in Lancaster and basically free themselves in Pennsylvania, right there. So this dramatic incident where the sheriff of Lancaster is confronting the leaders of this expedition, Samuel S. Forman and the overseer, Osmond, show me your papers, show me that you could traverse Pennsylvania, and you're allowed to do this. At the same time, the women are coming out, local women, without a whole lot of advance notice or any advance notice, and are trying to like engage these enslaved African Americans in conversation and convince them to jump the wagon train. So, and I wish there were more detail than this. This is the only source of this incident in history, that one of the enslaved African Americans, apparently a relatively high-ranking one in the family main house, the big house, if you will, tipped off the owner's agents that this was afoot, so that Osmond and Samuel S. Forman confronted the slaves. What's happening? So what's recorded is that the enslaved women made a joke of it and said, no, there isn't anything like this going on. If there is, it's not serious. Meanwhile, the local official decided that he did not have purview over a wagon train with the ownership papers of these enslaved African Americans from another state that was simply traversing Pennsylvania. He decided that he didn't have authority. He apparently convened his advisors, and they let the wagon train go. Intact. It's apparent from the account that the owners did not, this was all like a convincing, a psychological thing, I guess. There was no whippings, there was nobody put into chains, there was no one sold down river. The same people stayed with the wagon train. Like I said, they were not chained up and continued going. I researched this every which way for other historians. Who were the ladies of Lancaster? What a bunch of gutsy dames. I spent almost a week in the Lancaster Historical Society, going through all the prominent women who left papers, very few of them from that time, from the Judge Hubley himself, stuff like that, trying to get a handle on this. All I could tell was that an anti-slavery tract written by Benjamin Franklin for presentation at Congress was reprinted in full, completely, in both the German language newspaper of Lancaster and the Anglo language in that exact time frame. But it didn't say, did this apply to anything that happened in Lancaster or not? But at any rate, what an incident. This book's just filled with incidents like that, just surprising in their occurrence and their outcome, the actors involved. So at any rate, just to take the travelogue a little further, since it's unfamiliar territory, the group proceeded over the increasingly rough road to Pittsburgh, then Fort Pitt. It ran out of provisions in the mountains of Pennsylvania. And I won't tell you the incidents around that, except to just mention one of them. There was a slave revolt in western Pennsylvania. Now, mind you, the further this wagon train gets from civilization west of Lancaster, it's going towards hostile Native American territory, not quite there yet, but it's certainly sparsely populated. Population of Pittsburgh, Fort Pitt at that time, was 300, right? And the countryside was even less than that. And it's settled apparently by a mixture of folks coming up from Virginia who were very much supportive of slavery. This is like Western Pennsylvania now. and others who were anti-federal government, future whiskey rebellion people, people who did not have time for slavery at all. There's a recent book that I drew on whose title is The Colony Built from Hell. What it was talking about Pittsburgh and its vicinity in this time frame. A real mix-up of things. And this wagon train's going right through them. So the two disaffected fellows, who are two male African-American slaves, apparently allied with some locals who were anti-slavery, who armed them to have an armed slave insurrection on this. Okay, that didn't work either, but read the book for the details. It took them 3 weeks to get to Pittsburgh. Once you get to Pittsburgh, you trade in your wagons and most of your horses, except the prize, racehorse that they had, to build flatboats and keel boats, and you're going to take a run on the Ohio River for 1,000 miles, which just happens to be along the territory of this Northwest Indian Federation, who's dominating on the ground in the Northwest Territory and raiding these settler ships, whether they were intended for Ohio or Illinois or even going further, like this group, going to Spanish West Florida. And basically, the Indians were waging a war of terror against settlers to dissuade settlement. And there are some very inspirational leaders. I picked on Little Turtle of the Miami tribe, war chief of the Miami tribe. And the name Little Turtle, I think, was like a name given by later biographies to kind of, how would you say, make him sound more innocent. I mean, I think Terrible Terrapin might have been a better title for him. Incidentally, there is no word Little Turtle in his language. Minishakawa, I think is how you pronounce it in his language. So at any rate, he had a son-in-law who was a captive, family murdered in Kentucky around 1782, red-headed Caucasian guy, had been adopted into the tribe and became Little Turtle's son-in-law. And at least by accusations, would go out and try to decoy the settlers coming down river. In other words, a Caucasian person with a red head would run out saying, "Save me, save me, the Indians are going to get me." The flatboats would come in close. The Indians would attack and decimate the flatboats, called decoyers. So at any rate, I think we're getting into close to question period, so let me skip ahead. So there are adventures in Louisville, Falls of the Ohio. The group split up. The enslaved African Americans, and some of them continued downriver to become Spanish citizens, while Samuel S. set up shop to trade for tobacco and animal pelts in Louisville, and had a lot of interesting cultural interactions with the locals, who were these early Kentucky plantation owners and their children. Also met up General Wilkinson, who, if some of you know this period, was the highest ranking spy in the Army ever. He was known as Agent 13 for the Spanish. He was also the Secretary of War for the United States. Down the Mississippi, stops along the way, out of hostile territory into more friendly territory. Some interesting cultural clashes. I say amusing, maybe cringeworthy might be more appropriate, but some of these stories, which they're sort of being told by the diarist on the Native Americans or on the Spanish, somehow when you read them, a lot of these folks who's the butt of practical jokes come across as more dignified than the perpetrators. So you could read these things in a couple of different ways, and I think at least are amusing way to engage history. Get to Natchez. The Spanish are amazingly effective in Natchez in encouraging a slave-based agricultural economy. The Spanish West Florida purposely did not have implementation of the Spanish Inquisition, which the major part of old Spain did, the capital in Mexico City. So it was actually friendly to Protestant American settlers, and the vast majority of business was conducted in English. The wilderness plantation was created, built by the sweat of the African Americans. Cotton gin came along a few years later, coincidentally, made these enterprises fantastically successful and money makers for the owners. The Forman family is a major family, considered founder of Mississippi. The Spanish tried to get Samuel S. to stay, but he was not comfortable with what he was seeing, and he went north into the northern New York frontier. I discuss the African American experience in Natchez, the Native American experience, which was governing some of the success of these Americans in ways they didn't even know. And I relate the story of a major ball game over territory pitting the Creek Confederation against the Choctaws in central Mississippi. No Caucasians or plantation owners even present for this. Meanwhile, back in the Northwest Territory, the Native Americans defeated the entire United States Army in the largest defeat of the American Army ever, 3 times bigger than Little Bighorn. So not only were settlers unsafe, but for several years in the early 1790s, the United States Army was unsafe. George Washington took this as a major challenge of his first administration, called General Mad Anthony Wayne out of retirement to entirely retool the American Army as the American Legion, and it went out and it defeated the Northwest Indian Federation at the Battle of the Fallen Timbers. Several years later, you say, Americans worked to assert sovereignty in Mississippi Territory. The Spanish were not keen or quick to give it up. Although the Treaty of San Lorenzo transferred Spanish West Florida to American administration, the Spanish didn't actually give it up until 1798, which was the creation of Mississippi Territory. There was over a year in Natchez where there were 2 flags flying under a mile away, armed camps of the Spanish administration, which was still very active, and the American Army contingent guarding the border survey. And it was pretty uncomfortable. Now, General Forman got involved in a family legal dispute of large proportions. And when he stormed down to Natchez to assert his ownership over the plantations and the African Americans, he chose to hear his case in the Spanish tribunal, not the Americans. Interesting. Winthrop Sargent, some of whose papers Peter Drummy has taken out for those people here in the reception, was the New Englander, the first appointed American governor of Mississippi, who took over in 1798. And he apparently took his New England Puritan kind of background with him and was very unpopular with these Westerners. So just to summarize pertinent aspects of the book, It's a story of not North versus South like the Civil War. This is like North becomes South by choice of some, compulsion of others, over fierce Indian resistance, and with active encouragement of Spanish colonials. It's one story. It's an American story. I found it very challenging and ultimately uplifting. And it's an origin story for much of the country. I've talked for too long. I can tell that the audience here politely is still awake. I can't speak for the Zoomers, but do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
I have two questions I'll throw out. You can answer one or both. When you started out in New Jersey and they had the 60 enslaved people, what were they running the farm? Or I never heard about such a large contingent. And the second question, I was really interested in the Lancaster story, and since you only found one, how did you learn about that?
I'll answer both questions. Excellent questions. Thank you. I found the notion of 60 enslaved African Americans on one farm to be a bit far-fetched. So, amongst other things, I tracked down the antiquarians from Freehold, New Jersey, and from Monmouth. There's a fellow named Adelberg who's done several books, and a lot of them statistical. So the tax records from the state and province of New Jersey survive from relevant years. And indeed, most all farms, the largest farms, had tax ratables for enslaved African Americans around 6. So apparently, there was a lot of this buying and aggregating the families going on amongst the huge extended Forman family, and perhaps some other farms as well, to make up this 60. The actual acquisition records, if you will, or the ownership records of that group of 60 African Americans does not survive. So I had to infer that. And the second question, sir, was?
Just I was really interested in the experience in Lancaster.
Yes, yes.
How did you learn about that?
Yeah, so this is part of the excitement and also the frustration of just making sure that you're writing nonfiction. This diary was written decades after the fact by this guy named Samuel S. Forman, who apparently had an amazing memory for officers that he met, places, things like that. So Draper, the 19th century antiquarian and historian, looked at this diary very closely to verify every detail that Samuel S. had recalled decades later. And he could verify about 95% of them in other sources. So my inference is that it's probably, until proven otherwise, all really good recollections. That being said, the sole source of the Ladies of Lancaster is Samuel S. Forman's diaries. There are collections of known slave revolts that have been published. Aptekar, I believe, 1943 is one of the classics, and they've been updated, of slave revolts that have been documented that involved more than X number of men or women in revolt. This is not one of them. It is the only source. So it may have been misremembered by Samuel S., but given his track record of verifiable other details, including some of them really obscure, and the fact that why would you make up something like this? I took it in the narrative as fact, and the reservations about that are in the endnotes. But also, I'm going to leave it up to someone who's going to make the movie version of this or a fiction to flesh out, just who the Ladies of Lancaster were. I don't know, and I don't even have a name. Wish I did. Sir.
General David did not go on this trip, right? But he went later. I was wondering what, over the subsequent decades, was there lots of back and forth by Formans to Natchez?
The family split by 1800, but General Forman did not go on the initial pioneering trek, but he was the major domo, he was the energizing family members. Azkill Forman, as it turned out, established the plantations, Wilderness and Second Creek, and kind of conveniently forgot that his brother lent him the slaves. So Azkill, his widow, who was asserting like rights on the spot, over this far off in a separate country brother who says that he owns the plantations and the slaves. So at that point, when General Forman heard about this back in New Jersey, he stormed right down to Natchez in this really ugly as the bell means our time's up. Lucky quirk for me because the documentation of that legal case in Spanish court had such detail that I was able to reconstruct every room and every content in these plantations that were gone for 150 years and overcame the African-American genealogic brick wall to understand these families by name and descriptor and everything. That came from the legal records. So General Forman went as a legal case in 1795, and then karma caught up with him. I'll leave. And pirates were involved. One last question.
I'm wondering if you know what the population, the black population of Lancaster might have been, because I'm thinking it would have been a terribly difficult decision for African Americans to decide to leave their families, even if they wanted to be free, and stay someplace where there were no other African Americans.
There are Pennsylvania census that survives, and I believe the federal census for 1790 exists in that level of detail. Although the federal census of New Jersey for 1790 was lost, burned somewhere along the line by mistake, Pennsylvania exists. We know the answer to that. Off the top of my head, I think it was several hundred African Americans in the county, some enslaved, some free, most of them resident on farms. So my belief is that very few kind of native to Lancaster African Americans would have been encountered in the center of town at the chief tavern, which doubled as the office of Judge Hubley. But a lot of that's inference, and that is a really good question. So there weren't too many African Americans, and we might infer, and it's only inference because I don't know, that keeping the families together may have been more in the minds of the involuntary pioneers rather than kind of signing on to people they've never met before with all these promises in a town that they've never seen before of go work in my house and you're going to be free. You kind of trust the devil known better than the devil unknown, and also to jump, you're going to leave your family. So maybe Benaja Osman didn't have to crack the whip. He just let the slaves themselves make a joke out of it so that everybody would turn the other cheek and make pretend it didn't happen. I don't know. It's inference. By writing and sticking to nonfiction, when I encounter inferences like that, I do identify them as my inference in the absence of hard knowledge. I think some people would kind of interpolate, but I don't want anyone saying I've written fiction on this one. Thank you so much. You've been so very attentive.